my IRC name.
Everyone tweet it now.
Occasionally on IRC, I've had conversations with people that tell me at Stefan Penner told them something because I'm the other one on IRC. It's always funny till someone like Jay busts me. Anyway, so thanks to the previous two talks. They were awesome. You laid the foundation for what a web component is, for those that don't know. You laid the foundation of, well, don't quite work today. There's things that are missing. What can we do moving forward? So thank you very much. I'm new here. I just moved to the Bay Area like, what, 3 weeks ago. Came from New York. And the weather is quite nice here. Just took a job with Yahoo. And basically, I'm doing a whole bunch of open source to support the work that Mike and team and the larger team are utilizing. So let me introduce myself. I love open source. This is my GitHub profile, and I moved here. So I'm sorry. I think somewhere in there was my wedding anniversary and stuff. So I'm also a husband with a very patient wife. We have birds. I chose them based on my current color scheme of them. We got a new bird. He's a conure, Gen-Day conure, and he can't pair program because he can just kill my headphones in one chomp, which he's done already, which is not cool. But he can navigate when we're driving to conferences and stuff, which is cool. I'm on the Ember core team, so that means my hobby and my work and all my spare time goes into improving the framework. I'm on the team with about 12 or 13 other people, and our goal is to learn from our own pains. We're all app developers ourselves, learn from the community, and learn from other frameworks on how to make just an even better Ember. But not just that, we're actually part of the standardization committees as well. So we're improving the language, the DOM, the platform, the framework, the tooling, and it's fun. I'm also the creator of a tool called ember-cli. I can't take sole credit for this. I'm not even any longer the most active contributor on it, although I don't know how the other dude has surpassed me. He's amazing. But it's a community project. My goal is always to enable everyone who wants to participate. And interestingly, I have been working with the Angular team on them utilizing it or parts of it as part of their new CLI tool. If I wasn't at this meetup tonight, I would actually be having dinner with the Angular team, which is pretty cool. Like we were talking about before, there's a lot of collaboration between the actual frameworks, even though I know the consumers of the frameworks have this, like, they're on a warpath with each other, but whatever. So interestingly, recently my job has become my hobby, which is kind of a singularity of sorts, which is awesome. Although I feel guilty every day, where I was like, hey, sorry about all the extra stuff on GitHub, and one of my coworkers was like, hey, get back to work, and then I confessed how guilty I felt. He's like, no, wait, that is your job, don't feel bad. But it's strange working on open source primarily all day, whereas before I always snuck it in while I was doing other tasks at work, so it's great. Anyways, this allows me to fix all the bugs, improve the framework, improve the web platform itself, and I get to work with a really fun team, some of which are here today. Also, I've introduced Mike to very tasty coconut water that costs far too much, but it's really good. So if you guys want to spend a little bit more and have coconut water that actually tastes good, try this. Unfortunately, you can never go back.
It's like crack.
It's like cracker cane in coconut water form. So my talk today is about Ember and web components. Although I'll be talking about Ember, I think a lot of the topics are for any framework in web components, how they work with today. And when I was Google searching web components, I found a pretty cool web component that would be great to have in my app. All right, so what is Ember? Honestly, Ember is 70% polyfill for things that are missing in the platform, 20% research, 200% research and development for the same platform, and 100% community-centric way of thinking. Although there's a core team, we really are just an extension of the community itself. And as you can imagine, this pie chart is extremely hard to render. It may require an Oculus Rift to actually visualize. So Ember team has a dream. Basically, we want Ember's components, Ember's view layer, to just be a subclass of what the browser ships, which would allow us to implement this really cool component. This would be fantastic because we can easily share with React, with Angular, with custom frameworks with each other. We would get awesome isolation in theory and huge productivity boost. Unfortunately, when you peel away this wish and look at reality, you will realize that this isn't something you can do today if you want to ship to real browsers. An example of this is actually a tweet today I had from one of the Firefox developers who tweeted this example of ES6 syntax. Today, in Firefox Nightly, the extends keyword has landed. But there's a problem. There's actually a required super in the constructor, which turned into a surprised implementer saying, oh, really? I didn't realize this. So although these things are cool, we're still a ways away of actually being able to utilize them natively in the browser. So not quite yet. But tools like Babel.js allow us to transpile code that is for the future, the code that runs today. I'm part of that team as well. Isn't this too much work? Supporting the future today? Like, why would you do all this work, have a transpiler, compiler, AST transforms, work on performance, have quite literally 9,000 lines of code merely to port the future of JavaScript to your platform, and have frameworks like Ember, Angular, and React that together have hundreds of thousands of lines of code merely to port the future today? And I think it is absolutely worth it for two reasons. The first one is productivity. Shared knowledge. As we improve the underlying platform, the knowledge that you as a web developer will learn developing one will translate over much nicer if we have a shared common foundation. So one of the primitives in JavaScript is missing. You can't create classes or subclass in a standard way. Even though every framework has an implementation of this, they're entirely incompatible. So even at a baseline primitive, we can't compose various frameworks, which is crazy. Another thing is, as special syntax arrives, it becomes more concise. For example, we saw the example from Jay, and it was terse, concise, statically, like you could run a linter against that, it would make sense. The equivalent code in ES3 or ES5 syntax would be extremely verbose. A benefit of this concise syntax is the browsers know exactly what you want to do. They can give you fantastic debug tooling. Again, maybe not something we have today with the transpilers, but we'll get it with the platform. By having a improved platform, we'll have more library interrupt, and that would be fantastic. And framework interrupt. And like I said before, this talk, although about Ember, will be about many other frameworks. And an important thing to take into account is we have to ship to all of these browsers, most of us. I was talking to one individual here today who is lucky enough to only have to ship to Chrome, which would be everyone's probably dream. But in reality, if you're shipping to IE 10, IE 9, IE 8, IE 7, IE 6, these things just continuously disappear. But if your business makes money from these demographics, you have to build an application that works there. But you still want the productivity of the future today, so you can build these projects quicker, with less errors, and iterate and pivot as needed. So we want this productivity now. So we have to jump into the time machine and get it. So Ember tries to be this time machine a little bit. So the way that this works is, Ember is actually a fairly old project. It started off as Sprout Core in 2008, 2009. It has evolved into a very different framework now, but it has evolved as we have learned what the platform needs. And while we have done this, we have not just done this in isolation, we have put ourselves on standard bodies to help evolve the platform underneath us. So eventually, the framework and the platforms will evolve and converge to something much more closer than what we have today. So we kind of have to fake it till we make it, or till the platform that we're running on, which is the browser, makes it. So quick introduction, this is HTML. Who here has never seen this before? Good. Turns out that this is basically the lingua franca of web developers. This is something the browsers understand, and ultimately this is what any browser, any web framework will produce. There's also our lowest level of composition, reuse, and shareability. With Ember, we augment the DOM with interpolation, which allows us to have concise templates that are still inspired by the DOM that they represent. But it allows us to have loops and bindings. This is quite handy. So double curlies in Ember are for bindings. As you can see, not only can you do a binding and content, but you can actually do a binding in a subsection of an attribute's value, which is quite nice. Double curlies are also used for non-structural helpers. So in a pure DOMs world, you would have to do a div for an if. So if all of a sudden you were taking a designer's template and making it dynamic, adding dynamic aspects of your application, like an if or a loop, would add extra structure, which in theory could break the design. Change accessibility, all these things that we don't want to do. In addition to that, Ember has the ability to generate things that look like DOM templates, the web component spec. So these non-structural helpers are quite important, like I said before, just to prevent that whole, now we made it dynamic, all the styles have broken, or now we have changed composition of our application, the styles have broken. The double curlies basically boil down to stuff that don't really translate back to things directly in the DOM. So again, this is, although the templating engine that we saw before is a little bit different, this is the exact same output we would have written by hand if we were just generating something statically. This is the goal of Ember. Ember just builds HTML. Emberisms in this HTML don't pollute your HTML. They don't add extra constructs or extra ideas. Making them dynamic shouldn't break any styles. Think of the designers. Then why does Ember have so many bytes? How many kilobytes do you need to actually do this? Well, there's a lot more than Ember does, but specifically for this talk and this theme, we're going to talk about the DOM and the web component interface. Ultimately, business people want functionality. Those jerks. But the platform is deficient. As the LI becomes non-trivial, as we add functionality, for example, someone clicks on the LI, we should do something, rather than it just being an LI, maybe you want to upgrade it to be a web component. Well, we can't quite define everything statically in HTML. Although this is a contrived example, click you could actually define in HTML. The toggling behavior, maybe you can. So what Ember does is allows you to define a Ember component, which isn't exactly a web component yet, but it's inspired by web components, and it also inspires web components. But it provides functionality for the template that we see at the bottom, the component-entry. But ultimately, the HTML is identical to the HTML that we would have written statically. It is identical to the HTML that we would have written with just the basic templating. So again, the designer's code, the designer styles continue to work. This is productivity. In theory, we could also have it emit component-entry, which would be more web component-like. We don't do this today because we do support old browsers where this doesn't quite work properly yet. But we're thinking as we drop them, we will emit this type of syntax as well. But there's something to say about the fact that I want to actually leave the markup the way that it originally was, so styles continue to work. So the flexibility exists. So ultimately, Ember just builds HTML. Web components are just HTML. So in theory, Ember can produce web components. Very close. Jay has found the one place in Ember where we're basically preventing this today. But hopefully in the next little bit, we will fix this. So when we actually go to render component entry, rather than looking at the thing that Ember provided, we could just do a lookup on the DOM and see if this web component has been registered by one of Jay's libraries, for instance, and build it the same way we would build a div, go on our merry way, and we have a reusable component that just works in Ember. Now, Ember is a lot more about just rendering tags, but we actually want to have data moving through our application. It's a data-bound system. Someone changes full name, it should update in the template. Someone changes attributes, they should update accordingly. So how would a generic web component work in the context of Ember or basically any other framework? Well, interestingly, React says this really important thing. In order to make a really dynamic, resilient application, we want to push data down via bindings, and we want to bubble information up via actions. And Ember actually totally agrees. This is a great way of organizing your applications, and regardless of what framework you're using, when you're building reusable components, you should really think about this as your primitive for data flow. App instantly turns into. Might look like fun, but not when you have to ship and deliver on Tuesday and fix all the bugs. And remember, curlies in Ember are purely for bindings. In Ember, when we augment an anchor tag, which could just as well be J Phelps's cool web component, we are modifying an attribute via binding. So when user changes, this interpolates. And there's a DOM API where you can just set an attribute on a component. So if J's web component correctly implements said attribute, or whatever API that is, we have now passed data from Ember into arbitrary component that someone else has provided to us. And all we're using is the DOM API that was defined many, many years ago. And this is all we actually need to push data down into our web components. This is all we need to push data down into Ember components. This is all we need to push data down into React components. And I think the Angular guys either have come around to this idea as well, or I think they likely will. This thing that I thought I would never have to write manually again, well, I still don't have to write it manually, but it is the wonderful interface for pushing data down into the template. Boom, easy. Now, the other part of this was bindings down, so we push data down. The other part is getting information back up. So it's cool to write a read-only application where you display stats. But it turns out almost all the applications we write, users interact, and they give us back information that we then have to use to make choices like they're giving us money or they want to change information. And this information percolates back up via events. Ember has a concept of actions, and it has the concept of events. So in order for me to explain how this part will work, I have to sort of explain why Ember has two different concepts here. And what it really boils down to is this concept of an outlet. If we were to think about what an Ember outlet would be if we didn't have Ember and we were only embracing DOM technologies, it would basically be an iframe or a frame. This is really weird to actually think about. Who here has built an application with like copious amounts of iframes? Who here has enjoyed this experience? Who here enjoyed the experience because they like to give themselves a bad time? So it provides fantastic isolation, but it's pretty rough. Even like the debugging tools are kind of rough. But really, when I'm building an application, a really complicated application, I do want frames. I just don't want real frames because they're terrible. And we're jaded and we feel, we have this negative, they have a negative connotation. And we feel, but actually when I'm building a complex application, I do want this level of isolation. And why not just make these things top-level components? So the React world would say, hey, just make everything a component, everything is wonderful. Well, there's complexity, but honestly the biggest complexity is namespacing and naming of things. As your app grows, as you build mashups of other applications, it turns out if your entire namespace is web components, you have these incredibly long web component names like J-Phelps-rating-star thing, because just in case Stef has its own rating-star namespace or component, I can't collide with his. But frames in JavaScript and frames in the browser are entirely isolated, so they're actually a primitive isolation. But they suck. So what Ember provides is Ember provides outlets for this type of isolation. So what we want is we actually want frames and realms of components. And as we can see here, having these two different contexts, we would have to have left app entry and right app entry, which has no meaning. It would be unfortunate. So being able to have a certain level of isolation is useful. To coordinate these frames without Ember, without an Ember router, we would be using source on the iframe and twiddling the href or the source on these guys. And that's pretty ghetto, let's face it. We have single page apps, we want this to be rich. So the way that Ember does this is it describes the various hierarchies of its application with the router, which manages asynchrony and manages the coordination of these various outlets. Although this is the composition today, there's no reason why the router couldn't render them in the other order. It should just work. And cross-realm state is provided by services. So if you were building iframes or frames, you would use the local storage API or shared workers to persist state. So in Ember, we just have JavaScript objects that allow you to push information between these different realms. here's an example. I have in both of these frames, I will call them outlets from now, because saying the word frame makes me kind of cringe. I don't like it. I have a user session service that should actually be global, because for this particular application, the user state is global. Although the state for various things, like where they have sorted, where they're going, might be local, this truly is global. So back to actions and events. Why is there a difference? Well, actions bubble up via the app. Actions take into account which realm or which outlet they are in, whereas events bubble up the logical DOM, which means actions are isolated, events are not. Events just bubble everywhere. This sucks. There's misalignment. How can we use events and translate them into actions? We have to connect this loop in order for us to be productive and to utilize web components. So we have this rule, bindings down, more or less via set attribute or something along those lines. We still don't have a great solution for getting information out of these components. Well, it turns out we can just make events work. It's kind of ghetto, but it works. So, as we all hopefully all know, when we click on the browser, there's a capture phase where actions or events bubble down, and there's a bubble phase. All we do is we intercept this. We use another somewhat archaic API to build the interface to get information out of these generic web components. So, bindings up or bindings down, actions up. Don't reverse it. It's not good. Basically, it's just set attribute and add listener. So, a wild future appears. In this future, why the heck would we even bother using web frameworks in the first place? We have composition, we have isolation, everything is fantastic. Well, in order to look at this, let's think about why do people sometimes not want frameworks today? Often has to do with file size, a learning curve, lock into that framework, and just compatibility over time. We know that the DOM and the API for JavaScript, once it lands, it's set in stone for essentially forever. Frameworks change every day. The other aspect of this is why today do we sometimes want to use frameworks? Well, they give us a productivity boost. We don't actually want to be writing those low-level APIs everywhere. That's terrible. And even if we wanted to write those low-level APIs, we couldn't actually do it as fast as React or as fast as Glimmer can do it for a large application. The amount of knowledge that it has over your entire system would be outrageous for you to implement and hand-roll yourself. We also have these frameworks because there really just is a platform deficiency. As I explained before, iframes and frames we don't really use. Or we don't use to the extent that they could be used if, in fact, they weren't as efficient as they are today. And then there's non-platform related concerns like business logic, dependency injection. They probably always belong in a framework or a library area. And then ultimately, within the ecosystem of our framework, we want to be able to share and reuse. So again, as the platform improves, this is what Ember wants to become. We want to inherit from HTML element as we're allowed to. Why? We get better primitives. Because of that, we can reduce our file size dramatically. Because of these better primitives, if in fact you know how to use the DOM, you would know how to use Ember. In theory, you'd know how to use Angular. In theory, you know how to use React. And because the primitives are the same primitives as the web, ideally you should be able to use a React component in an Ember app and an Ember app in a React component, as well as Angular. Now, that clearly might be a pipe dream, but we can strive for it anyways. So we get productivity, platform deficiencies, solutions, non-platform concerns, but this is the big goal, and that is the ability to share. There's a lot of smart people in every framework camp, and it's really a shame when a really cool library exists for one, and you have to port it to the other. It'd be much better if you could just utilize it. That's like one of the main reasons why Jay is doing what he's doing right now, is this pain that exists. People should be able to express themselves how they want when they're programming. They should use the framework that fits with them best. But it's really unfortunate if that also means rewriting every cool piece of tech that some other collaborator in a different realm has done. So ultimately, many hands make light work. If we all work together, we'll live happily and we'll live at a cool beach. So I'm from Canada. It's really cold there. It's like -40 there right now. So the fact that there's an ocean that I can like stand, even though it's cold, it's still mind-boggling. I know all you people from California are like, this is not cool stuff. We have no idea. So this is kind of starting already. This is Igor Minar from the Angular team, who saw a picture of me wearing the Angular t-shirt at the Ember core meeting and This collaboration is healthy. All of these frameworks are ultimately circling in on very similar things. The more we share, so one of the things that Igor and myself have set out to try and improve is both of our ecosystems suffer from some pain points with NPM and browser side package management. If we can solve that, we will solve it for the ecosystem. With that, hopefully we can start sharing web components between these ecosystems. This is just a good thing. And now Igor wants an Ember t-shirt, which is pretty good. So we have a bright future ahead. I'm excited by this. That's all for now. And I think I'd like to call these two guys up, and we would love to get your questions and discuss a little bit more about web components, the future of web components, and the future of the web. Thank you.